Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry to interrupt the conversation, but I hope you can continue that either through sign language or during the coffee break. Good afternoon. Welcome to CSIS. My name is Matthew Goodman. I hold the Simon Chair in Political Economy here at CSIS, and I work on Asian economics, including Japan. Delighted to see such a good turnout today. I'm sure it's the free lunch that brought you here, but hopefully there are other reasons as well. Those of you watching online don't have the benefit of the free lunch, but we're delighted you're here. You're welcome as well, so delighted to have you. A few administrative notices. First of all, could you put your noisemakers of any kind on stun? If you are inspired to tweet, you may do so quietly. The handle is @CSIS, and the hashtag is CSIS Live. Appreciate your using that. There is coffee on the Samnun Terrace throughout the afternoon, and there are restrooms around the back behind me here if you go around outside. In an emergency, the unlikely event of an emergency, there are emergency exits also behind me, and of course down the main staircase out onto Rhode Island Avenue. Just follow me. So when we sent the notice out for this event a couple of weeks ago, we got a lot of snarky comments back about the use of post-TPP in the title. A lot of people thought we were getting ahead of ourselves, a little too optimistic. But as you know, we now think that we were prescient in actually predicting. Maybe we even had an impact on the outcome since the deal was done early last week. But seriously, what we were really trying to do here, the idea for this event, long before we knew that TPP was going to be done, was to look beyond TPP at what the U.S. and Japan are doing, what we can do, what we should do together in the economic sphere, whether TPP was successful or not. So really this idea was, what do we do now beyond TPP, whether it succeeded or failed? And now it's gotten this far. We're fairly confident it will succeed in its final ratification, but that's something we'll touch on here. But we're really going to, in fact, we will pause a little bit on the question of TPP today in a way that I think we hadn't intended to originally. I'm happy to talk about that, and I'll give you my own thoughts. I'm sure Kurt will touch on it. Maria Solis as well, our moderator of our expert panel, I'm sure we'll talk about it, and I'm sure you're going to have questions. But for me, I think through all the early commentary about the TPP agreement, good and bad, informed or otherwise, it's important that we step back and note how historic TPP really is. Certainly not only as the most complex trade agreement that's been reached in over 20 years and arguably ever, but also as representing effectively a U.S. Japan free trade agreement, something that would have been thought unimaginable just a few years ago. So I think we should take stock of that before we get into the back and forth over what's good and bad about TPP. And in fact, I would go further and say beyond just strengthening the economic relationship, TPP is really significant in terms of its advancing the U.S.-Japan alliance more broadly. A lot of people don't know, even experts on the security alliance don't know that economic cooperation is at the heart of our alliance. In fact, it's mentioned in Article 2 of the Security Treaty of 1960, and if you'll allow me, I'm going to read that entire article, which says, "The parties will contribute toward the further development of peaceful and friendly international relations by strengthening their free institutions, by bringing about a better understanding of the principles on which those institutions are founded, and by promoting conditions of stability and well-being." And then the money sentence, literally, "They will seek to eliminate conflict in their international economic policies and will encourage economic collaboration between them." Again, this is Article 2, not Article 22 of the Security Treaty. So TPP helps fulfill a core treaty obligation, but it obviously isn't the end of the story. And the point of this conference is really to say that the work of economic collaboration between the U.S. and Japan is not done. that we need to look at a range of areas where we are working together, as I said, or where we could or should work together more, and then to put all of this in a strategic framework in the context of our alliance. So we have a terrific group of speakers today to help us do that. I'll introduce our keynote speaker in a moment, but following him, we'll have an expert panel, as I mentioned, moderated by Maria, to look at a kind of smorgasbord of different, a really eclectic array of really interesting areas in which the U.S. and Japan are cooperating in the economic space, not as well known, I think, to a broad Washington audience. We picked four, diverse group of topics. One is internet governance. Another is space. I just saw The Martian last night, and so I'm particularly looking forward to that one. Quality infrastructure we're going to talk about, and then regional and global economic governance, which I'll talk about on the panel. Obviously, these are not the only areas of bilateral economic cooperation, but all four of them help shine light on the U.S. and Japan's shared interests in areas where new rules are needed or where existing approaches are or may be contested by others. So we hope that this will all make sense once you hear all of the presentations. We'll end the afternoon with an armchair conversation up here with three longtime stewards of the U.S.-Japan economic relationship, looking at the past, present, and future of our economic relations. It's worth sticking around for that. With that, I have the pleasure of introducing my old friend and colleague, Kurt Tong, who will give today's keynote presentation. Kurt's official title is Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic and Business Affairs at the State Department, which makes him the senior career official at the State Department responsible for economic policy and economic statecraft. Kurt, as everyone I think here knows, is a longtime Japan hand, speaks fluent Japanese. Prior to this posting was the Deputy Chief of Mission at our embassy in Tokyo, and he's also served all over the Asia-Pacific region. I actually first read Kurt's work before I actually met him, I think, in the early 1990s. He wrote a very thoughtful treatise on U.S.-Japan trade relations, sort of in the heat of all the bilateral trade friction, which was, I think, called Time for Plan C, in which he proposed something like a free trade agreement between the United States and Japan. So talk about prescient. So with that, please join me in welcoming Kurt Tong to the podium. Kurt. You jump there. You can make a big step. There we go.
Well, thank you, Matthew, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be with such a fine audience on a beautiful day. Turned out not to need my umbrella, which is all very good. And special thanks to CSIS for hosting this event, and also to the Japanese Embassy, which, as I understand, is supporting us, at least indirectly. And apologies in advance to my colleagues at the Embassy if you don't like everything that I say. So the timing of this event is really kind of curious. You know, we have a choice here. Either Matthew is somehow a prophet of success and reads the tea leaves better than everyone else on the planet, or he was in fact putting extraordinary pressure on Mike Froman to close in order to have this event be even more timely. Regardless of the circumstances of the timing of this post-TPP being one of the first discussions after actually making TPP a negotiated reality, it is timely, I think. Part of the conversation today, I think, will be reminding ourselves of the great importance of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and its enormous value to the United States as well as to Japan. And just briefly on that, I think that there are a number of things which are just revolutionary about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. First and foremost, it's a fantastic market access agreement with an enormous amount of market opening that will result from the negotiated outcomes. It has encapsulated and enshrined, if you will, new provisions on environmental issues and labor issues, which we expect will become now a global model, no longer just a model for the United States free trade agreements, but something that the rest of the world will start to aspire to as they shape their own trade relations around the planet. It has the best provisions ever on issues like intellectual property rights, services, cross-border investment, the handling of data, all of which are absolutely vital to a 21st century economy, and very, very important to the United States economy as it exists today. And finally, it is a fantastic agreement on issues that are problem-solving in advance of the problem happening. Transparency provisions and regulatory cooperation provisions, which will avoid additional problems in the future by leading governments to talk about their regulatory regimes and talk with their own publics about their regulatory regimes as they evolve, and in that way we'll be avoiding problems going forward. You know all that. It's worth reminding ourselves as even I turn now to a discussion of Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, of course, we're going to need to implement this agreement and get it through Congress. I believe that the administration is and should be confident of that, but it's going to take work. And also the implementation aspect is something that my folks at the State Department are working very closely with USTR to make sure that our embassies around the region will be very diligent in ensuring full implementation of all the provisions of the agreement as it is approved by the legislatures in each of the countries. But today is like this is kind of fun actually, so we can put all that aside for a moment and look and think about what next. And that's a bit of a rare opportunity to think about the U.S.-Japan economic relationship. What are its long-term objectives? What should we be really working on and trying to achieve in this vital relationship going forward? So like any good forward-looking conversation, I'm going to start by looking back. The TPP agenda, if you think about it, was in fact shaped more by the conversation between the United States and Japan over the last 30 years on economic issues than any other bilateral relationship. We've got a very active dialogue with China now, and certainly the measures in TPP are shaped in anticipation of the needs to combat and address emerging sectoral and structural problems in economic management going forward, with China very much in mind, along with other very important emerging economies around the world. And also, TPP takes into account the 21st century issues that I mentioned, the whole question about intellectual property and services and investment, data management. But the TPP in some ways is also shaped by trying to figure out what, and including the fact that Japan then participated in the TPP, what could we do in a trade agreement which would address many of the concerns that we've had in the U.S.-Japan relationship over the last 30 to 40 years. So let's look back on the U.S.-Japan economic discourse. And the question then is, how far back do we go? Do we go all the way back to the black ships, which was sort of the beginning of our economic relationship when we're trying to find coaling stations and open markets? That's probably too far. So we could go back to the 1930s and talk about failed U.S. economic sanctions, compare those to our sanctions on various nations in the modern era, but that's much too dark a conversation for such a nice sunny day. So why don't we start with the period in the 70s and 80s when the issue became quite hot between the United States and Japan as Japan resumed its innate competitiveness after the post-war disaster. The 1980s, I think, saw high drama. We all remember people slamming sledgehammers through Toshiba. I was going to say laptop. I can't even remember, what do you call it? Thank you, cassette player. Who doesn't know what a cassette player is in the room? We have some young people here. This was caused essentially by stagflation in the United States, leading to great strength in the U.S. dollar, which led to a surge in the U.S.-Japan trade deficit. And we had fierce discussions about all this, if you recall. the yen-dollar talks were at the fore for a while and led by Treasury, and very, very intense conversation. And then we got to the Plaza Accord. This is when I started waking up from teenage sleep, and I remember making a lot of money off the Plaza Accord, because I took my little stipend that I got from college to Japan before the Plaza Accord, stuck it in the bank, and then when I moved back from Japan later, had like a 60% return on investment. It was really awesome. But there was a sharp change in the exchange rate as a result of the Plaza Accord. But, oh no, it didn't do the job. We still had this enormous trade deficit with Japan growing. Japan was taking over the world. Japanophobia, someone wrote a book with that on the title. They bought Rockefeller Center. Oh my God, what are we going to do? So then the U.S. government got serious about this and started to think about the structural differences between the Japanese economy and the U.S. economy and how these were shaping our trade relationship. And the result was a series of very intense discussions. And one of them was called the Structural Impediments Initiative. Clearly, the person that came up with a name for that did not work on Madison Avenue. But Matthew and others were violently in there pushing away on various non-tariff barriers in Japan and trying to urge Japan to increase domestic demand through budgetary measures, and it was quite an intense conversation. And then the successor to that was the framework talks, which President Clinton came in, said this isn't good enough, we need to do more. And there was a new flavor even added in at the time, which was, and people that didn't like it called it managed trade, and people who thought it was a good idea called it results-oriented negotiation. But there was a new flavor where there was really a very targeted approach to trying to address sectoral and structural issues with some success. I wouldn't say it was a raging success. And then the Japanese economy went like this, and the conversation shifted to macroeconomic stability and financial stability. But at the same time, we still continued the drumbeat of unhappiness and uncertainty about Japan's structural economic future, with talks like the Regulatory Reform Initiative and its successor, the Economic Harmonization Initiative, aimed at so-called Kisei Kanwa. We weren't allowed to call it deregulation because that was considered too aggressive, so it was only like lighter regulation, or sort of relaxing regulation. And that was the atmosphere when a misguided young junior officer at the embassy in Tokyo in 1995 wrote a paper called Time for Plan C. Now, the Foreign Policy magazine, when they printed it, they thought that was a stupid title. They actually, I think, used the word stupid, and said, why don't we call it Revolutionizing America's Japan Policy? And I said, well, that's a little bit too much, don't you think? But they ran it that way anyways. But the basic idea was to do essentially something like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, to tackle structural economic issues in the context of a free trade agreement area by providing that additional incentive to accomplish economic change by the, if you will, carrot of creating a lasting, solidified, clearly outlined bilateral economic arrangement, similar to what was envisioned in the security treaty that Matthew read to us. Now, that didn't happen, and we went through additional churn for another 10 to 15 years before reaching TPP now. And the conversation started to turn around 2010. And the thing that really changed things, I think, was that the discussion went not just from how to address U.S. Japan bilateral economic relations, because that was also that was shifting away from being a top priority for either government to being an important priority, but not the top priority. But the conversation shifted to shouldn't we do a comprehensive FTA for the region because of the changing dynamics of the Asia-Pacific region. And that added context of shaping the rules of the road in the Asia-Pacific, which is what you've always heard the last 4 or 5 prime ministers, as they've been saying positive things, maybe 3 or 4, about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, have always been referring to this question of shaping the rules of the road in the Asia-Pacific. and Japan not, frankly, wanting to be left out of the conversation. So looking back at all this, and apologies for the history lesson for those of you that know it better than I do, what were the main characteristics of this conversation? Regardless of whether Japan was seen as very strong or Japan was seen as very weak, which was the case immediately after the financial crisis. And there's some common characteristics throughout those 30 years. First, there was, as you would expect in a politicized environment, a primacy or a top priority put on short-term perceived issues, the trade friction issues, trade deficit question, and then the question of immediate Japanese economic recovery. Governments tend to focus on those short-term questions. There was a very heavy emphasis on the government-to-government channel being the one that was getting all the attention and being the most important conversation. And that is a fact which I think was actually not optimal in a sense, because there was a lot going on in the private sector that wasn't being perceived or being ignored. And there was an assumption throughout that Japanese economic policy adjustment, Japanese economic policy change in Tokyo was slower than was desirable or slower than quote-unquote normal, and that it required special effort to in conversations of gaiatsu or naiatsu, external pressure, internal pressure, to try and get Japan to change. And that was another assumption. So government to government, Japan's slow, and short-term focus being kind of predominantly dominating the conversation throughout. But let's think about this for a second in a long-term perspective. And I actually, when I moved back to Tokyo in 2011, after having been gone for a dozen years as a resident, found that there was quite a lot that had happened that was being missed in that conversation. That there was a lot of changes in Japanese political economy as well as its economy that were not really being gathered and understood that widely in the usual conversation in rooms like this. I would name three trends that became obvious after a little bit of observation. One was that the U.S. economy was fundamentally stronger than we like to think it is, because we like to beat ourselves up, but that our economy is quite strong, driven by a very powerful startup culture, a unique approach to high technology, and internet and innovation, and also the very steady but increasing global integration of our strongest companies. Second, that the Japanese economy was bifurcating, was splitting into ever more sharply into a set of globally competitive firms, world-class firms that were operating on very similar terms to other globally competitive firms from the United States or from Europe around the world, and were not really always viewing themselves so much as Japanese companies, although their management was always and continues to be very Japanese, but that their approach to business was becoming extraordinarily global. At the same time that, on the other hand, the domestic economy in Japan was extraordinarily sluggish, with continued low productivity growth, and looking more and more European every day. European in some good ways too, like safe and great food, but not really growing that fast. And sort of structural underemployment in a weird way, even though the unemployment numbers were low in Japan. Lots of people not working, not low labor force participation rate, and the like. And then third, at the same time, U.S. and Japanese firms, the global firms, the strong firms, were becoming really increasingly intertwined, very, very closely related to one another. In particular, not these sort of arm's length trade relationships that get caught in the trade statistics, but actually deeper relationships, sometimes financial relationships, but more often in technology and in innovation, and particularly as Japanese companies started to focus on the strengths of the American innovative culture, getting into R&D, group R&D together. And that has also changed the relationship. It's no longer like us versus them. At the end of the day, a lot of the stuff that we buy and we own, we're really not sure where it's made anymore. And it's likely to have both a lot of U.S. content and a lot of Japanese content, not just in terms of like the stuff, but the ideas that went into making it. And that's a very different situation. So there have been attempts to think about the future and what the dialogue should look like. And I'll give some credit to the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo that has been putting an emphasis on some of these issues like innovation and entrepreneurship, questions about our educational systems. But there's been some of that attention. But frankly, let's be honest, and rightly so, most of the attention over the last 5 years has been on Trans-Pacific Partnership. Getting Japan to participate, Japan convincing itself it wanted to participate, and then closing the deal. And now and again, obviously, we're not done. So now what? What happens going forward? I have a question for you all. Did you know? Well, let me ask it this way. And if anyone gets the exact number, they get an extra free lunch. How many U.S. Japan dialogues are there, government-to-government dialogues, in the economic and environment, science, technology, health space, including energy issues and the like? Today, as of the latest count from the embassy, which I received on Friday. Ding, 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 ding. 37. Anyone?
I said 37.
You said 37? Did you cheat?
No? Is that right?
Yeah. Okay, so Matthew gets another free lunch. Yay! Okay. There's a lot. Now, as a taxpayer, you may be dismayed to know that there's this much activity going on between our governments, but actually, trust me, it's extraordinarily valuable, and I saw a lot of that when I was DCM out in Tokyo. But these are the kind of topics that are covered. Science and technology development, space exploration, environmental protection, renewable energy, energy security, nuclear energy, health issues, vaccines, maritime policies, the internet economy, which my colleague Danny Sepulveda will be speaking on in a few minutes, cybersecurity, agricultural and phytosanitary discussions. There's a whole bunch of those, and some of them are for specific creatures, which is interesting. Development cooperation, the innovation and entrepreneurship dialogue that I mentioned, which is aimed at trying to develop more of a sort of Silicon Valley type culture in Japan, as well as addressing one of what I think is still Japan's most abiding and problematic microeconomic weakness, which is its continuing hostility to mergers and acquisitions. But what should be, so out of that mishmash, 37 odd topics, what do we expect to be the main themes going forward in U.S.-Japan economic relations, U.S.-Japan economic cooperation? And rather than going through 37 topics with you, in which case you would all run screaming from the room, let me suggest that there are three broad themes that we should be thinking about going forward. The first is shaping global policies. The second being promoting technological and entrepreneurial cooperation. And the third being addressing what in 2015 phraseology one could call inclusive growth challenges in both the United States and Japan. And as we think about tackling these kind of topics together, it's really important to remind ourselves, as Matthew already did once, that the United States and Japan are allies in every sense of the word. Every sense of the word. We have shared values, we have a shared sense of purpose, and we both want and need the other to succeed. And that should be the starting point for examining this conversation. And I think it's very important to have that in mind as we think about some of these concepts. So, number one, shaping global policies. This extends, of course, beyond the economic policy realm, but there are key economic policy issues that the U.S. and Japan need to be consulting on, cooperating on, and in some cases negotiating in order to shape the planet in a way that we both want it to evolve. There's a common conversation, and I haven't raised it prominently today, around the sort of whole Asia-Pacific architecture question, what to do about APEC, what to do with ASEAN, future of the TPP and the like, and those are important elements. But there are also things that are more global and not just regional in context. The reform of the Bretton Woods system is something that we both need to be working on. Reshaping how infrastructure is financed to achieve more public-private approaches and better outcomes, which I think is going to be one of the topics for the next panel. Shaping global trade policy through the extension of the TPP high standard vision to more emerging economies, as well as to Europe, which we're attempting to do through the TTIP, but Japan also has its own conversation with the European Union. Cooperating together through the G7 and the G20, a very hot topic in my mind for next year, given that Japan will be hosting the G7 and China the G20. Joint efforts on poverty alleviation, addressing endemic and communicable diseases. The whole question of protecting the internet from anti-democratic forces is an important topic. Maximizing the bang for the buck in our development cooperation. And of course, the shared challenge of climate change. That's a lot. And the United States and Japan as the first and third largest global economies and like-minded nations should be working and can and should be and are to a certain extent working very, very closely on these. But I think we can do more because any of these will benefit from cooperation between the U.S. and Japan. And without that cooperation, in fact, I think it's much less likely that we will succeed. The second question of promoting technological and entrepreneurial cooperation. As I mentioned before, the last 2 decades, the recent 2 decades, haven't really seen much of a growth in bilateral trade, and also not much of a change in the deficit. The trade deficit is measured as it's commonly measured, and that has led to less political attention to those questions. But that fact of sort of steady trade numbers has in fact masked a growth in interrelationship between the U.S. and Japan in a technological sense. And there's also been spurts of bilateral investment, although that has been mostly in the direction of Japan to the United States. But this masks a deep integration in financing and supply chains and technology and research and development, and even to some extent in the area of corporate control. And this integration, this tying up of activity and cooperation at the firm level between companies and between technology sectors and between universities and between startups and everyone else has made both of our nations stronger. And that's something we need to, maybe the governments don't need to be in the lead on this, but we should be certainly thinking about how do we facilitate greater work in this area. One thing we can do, I think, is of particular importance, is make sure that both our countries have a next generation of people who are interested in working with the other country. And as an American, I'm particularly concerned, actually, in the whole question of the declining cadre of people who are fluent in America, in Japan. And yes, the burden of bridging the gap, the cultural gap and the language gap between the U.S. and Japan has ridden heavily on the shoulders of Japanese people over the last decades. And I dare say there are more Japanese people in this room who speak English than the reverse. But there's still an empirical decline in the number of people in Japan that are spending time in the United States and learning English and learning about the U.S. And I think that we need to do something about that. The embassy in Tokyo, the Tomodachi Initiative, and other things has been active in that regard, but I think our governments need to work more on that. In particular, we need, for lack of a more polite term, binational geeks. Not just like people that want to do pottery. I have nothing against pottery. It's great. But we actually need like the people that know how these things work, which does not include me, in each country working together so that those relationships are being built going forward. And finally, addressing inclusive growth challenges. Now, U.S. society has, I think it's a fact, seen stagnating real wage growth for much of the middle class over recent decades. And I would venture that the cause of that is technology changes that increase each worker's per capita productivity, but also allow that worker, even as their productivity is increased, to be more replaceable. And how do we address that is a fundamental question for the U.S. economy. Clearly, education is key to the answer to that, as is even greater service industry growth in higher wages service industry jobs, all aimed at keeping workers on the cutting edge and making them stronger. Japanese society, on the other hand, has some of those same problems, but its biggest challenges on the inclusive growth front are in fact demographic and geographic. And to explain what I mean by that, they're demographic in the sense that Japan has a growing, if you will, underclass of elderly people who are surviving on diminished pensions in difficult circumstances and increasingly detached from society. And there is a huge bifurcation between urban Japan and rural Japan in terms of economic growth. And the rural parts of Japan are being dramatically left behind by the current pattern of economic development. So I think that some of the answers to these questions are things that we could tackle a bit better by learning some from each other in how we each address these questions. For example, it's a bit of a cliche, but there's a lot that the U.S. could learn from Japan on questions of educational performance, particularly bringing up performance among low-performing groups. The U.S. tends to be really good at educating the high-performing groups, particularly in tertiary education, but there's a question about how we can make sure that we're getting to everybody in our educational system. For Japan's purposes, I think that Japan could learn a lot from the United States about rural sector development, how to encourage people to move back into the countryside, and the whole question of agricultural revival. Because certainly Japanese agriculture is going to continue to exist, and in my opinion is going to get even stronger going forward post-TPP. If you think about it for a moment, particularly looking at Hokkaido, but actually all of Japan, with a declining population, Japan is probably the best positioned country in Asia to be an agricultural superpower. It has increasing amounts of land, it has technology, and it has water. The main inputs to agricultural production are water and technology. It's not really land or that's an old-fashioned concept of what agriculture is. I think that could be turned around based upon increased cooperation with the United States, perhaps in capital relationships or in other forms. So anyhow, I've gone on long enough, right? Yes, I have gone on long enough. That's some food for thought. Some ideas for what the U.S. and Japan might be thinking about in the remainder of this, or at least the next couple of decades going forward, having achieved our vision of a government-to-government relationship through the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is crystallized and affirmed and has a way of dealing with problems as they arise. But it's a vision, I think, for utilizing our shared values and our shared vision to really tackle some of these problems around the planet, to bring our companies ever closer together, and to address some of the weaknesses in our economies and our societies together. So thank you for your attention, and look forward to being roundly criticized. Thank you.
Thank you, Kurt. That was terrific. A really rich presentation, a lot of food for thought, and I'm going to watch that again on the tape when it goes up on our website later, because there was a lot of detail there that was really interesting and that I want to digest more. I have a lot of questions for you, but I want to let the audience ask a few. We'll take about 5 minutes worth of questions. I was remiss at the beginning, though Kurt did it for me, in thanking the government of Japan for making this event possible, and we appreciate the ability to have a platform to talk about these issues. So we'll take questions. There are microphones, so please wait for that, and then identify yourself and ask a quick question. I think I'm going to take a batch of questions so we can facilitate the time. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. Lauren Hershey, I'm semi-retired attorney, did work in the antitrust division, breaking up AT&T back where you started talking about the Japan-U.S. relationship getting bad in the early 80s. I'm a free trader by philosophy. I commend everything that you're doing. How are you going to get this complex message out to the American people? That's my
About
question.
free trade or about TPP specifically?
About the 25-minute presentation. What's the strategy to get this out to the American, but not just Capitol Hill, not just staffers, but...
Got it. Okay. Let's take a couple of others. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, enjoyed your presentation very much. I'm Saori Kadada from University of Southern California. My question is about Abe's third arrow, or the old Abenomics third arrow that's kind of was very much looking forward to TPP to become this kind of a Gaia to reform Japan's various structures, which has, again, as you mentioned already, kind of inefficiency in the domestic economy. And in some ways that created some backlash in Japan too, where many Japanese were worried about changing their way of life and losing jobs and so on and so forth. So now that TPP in terms of negotiations is in place, how would you advise the Japanese government to deal with that type of challenge and kind of make TPP more of a happy ending rather than a kind of a plight for the Japanese people? Thank you.
Thank you. Zhang Yue with China Daily. I have two very brief questions. The first question is that China, being the second largest economy in the world, not included in the TPP treaty, how would you evaluate the putting forward relations between China and U.S., between Japan and U.S. economic ties? How would this kind of relations have impact with U.S. economic relations with China? The second question is that do you consider the economic independence between the U.S. and Japan as the most important pillar between the two countries' relationship in general? Thank you.
Thank you. Bing Ruang with Hong Kong Phoenix TV. Secretary Tong, you actually a similar question on China. You briefly mentioned the conversation with China regarding TPP. Could you please shed more lights on that? What's the expectation on China right now? And what's the impact on China after the conclusion of TPP? And how many challenges you've seen on China to join TPP? Thank you.
Well, thanks for those comments and questions. Perhaps addressing the third arrow comment first. I think that my hope is that the conclusion of the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations will provide some new momentum and attention for Prime Minister Abe and other leaders in Japan as they double down on this whole question of structural economic reform and continuous improvement, kaizen of the Japanese economy. Every economy needs to be thinking about competitiveness. My hope is that the Japanese people as well will understand that conversation to be, or that initiative to be one that's focused on competitiveness, and really think about ways that Japan can be more competitive, because that's the way that pushes the country forward. I don't think that TPP, in a sense, is really a Gaiatsu question, because it was Japan's decision to join and Japan's decision to finish it, and the decisions which were made throughout the process were entirely driven by, I believe, the Japanese desire for pushing forward and becoming more competitive going forward. And the TPP was just a convenient mechanism for accomplishing that. But there, as you point out, there are a lot of issues in Japanese economic change which go beyond TPP, questions of corporate governance, questions of the regulatory system, the whole question around pensions and the fiscal situation, that require really concerted effort, and I think that's worth a lot of attention. The whole question on like the young lady here asked two questions really. First is the U.S. Japan economic relationship the most important pillar? I think that to be a solid relationship and a truly strong relationship, it needs to have multiple pillars. The economic one is very, very important, which I think is why it was in Article 2 of the Security Treaty. The U.S. and Japan also benefit from a very close military cooperation relationship, very, very strong political ties, and also good people-to-people discourse. I think that third one is actually the one I worry about the most and the one that needs continual emphasis. But all of those, if you will, are necessary for a healthy relationship. And that's the kind of relationship that the U.S. Would like over time to realize with China as well, I think. The question about China's participation, I think it was phrased, what should China be doing in response to TPP? The one answer is that China should read the TPP text and think about what it might be able to do to move in the direction of what is agreed to in the TPP arrangement, because those practices have been agreed upon by the 12 nations because they're good for all of those nations and they're good for the region in terms of transparency, open markets, freer capital markets, et cetera. TPP kind of paves the way for what should happen in the future, and I think that's a good template for things that China could be doing on its own as it thinks about its own economic policy future. More specifically, I have another more selfish answer to that, which is that China should put even more effort into the bilateral investment treaty negotiation with the United States. That's a very good venue for working on a lot of important issues, and China's shown a lot of energy around that discussion, and we hope that it continues to be very focused on that and really push forward some of the interests and forces within China which are maybe slowing things down. So I think that's a really good avenue for forward motion. And the question, I think you actually, where's the gentleman? You asked a very difficult question actually about how to explain what you rightly criticize as an overly long presentation and get the American public to absorb the value of the U.S. Japan relationship to the United States in an economic sense. It's difficult because it's hard to put out a one-liner, and I'm not sure who would pay for an advertising campaign. You know, there was a book published once, Japan is #1, and someone else could put out a book saying, U.S.-Japan relationship is the most important bilateral relationship bar none. That's been said before. It's still true, and so maybe you should write that book. But in a non-glib sense, I think it's just something that we all have to work on, and work on reminding American people about the importance of the relationship with Japan, because Japanese people tend to be a little bit self-effacing, and so we need to help them with that and have work on that a little more forcefully going forward.
Terrific. I think we're going to have to wind this up because we're running a little over time, but let me just say I think that on that last question, it is hard. The good news is that Japan polls very well in the United States and vice versa, and the people-to-people stuff is strengthened by the pottery and the anime and the other things that do help give a very solid foundation of understanding mutual kind of respect and liking for each other that I think can be the basis for then talking about these more complicated issues. They are hard to boil down to a soundbite, but really important, and we hope we're going to flesh out some of those further today. But thank you, Kurt, for really giving us a great start, touching a lot of the themes that we're going to cover all day. So thank you. Please join me in thanking Kurt. Thanks, sir.